You're listening to The Current, part of the Brookings Podcast Network. I'm your host, Adriana Pita. The first round of France's presidential election narrowed the field of 12 candidates down to 2. Current President Emmanuel Macron and recurring far-right challenger Marine Le Pen, who will face off in a second round of voting on April 24th. Earlier this week, Brookings visiting fellow Célia Belin and senior research assistant Agneska Bloch, in a Twitter Spaces conversation moderated by Preet Kaur, examined the issues motivating French voters, including Russia's war in Ukraine, how Macron and Le Pen have changed since they last campaigned in 2017, and what they will need to do in the coming weeks to win over more of the electorate. Now, over to Remen.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Twitter Spaces conversation on the first round of the French presidential election. My name is Preet Kaur, and I'm from the communications department at Brookings. This conversation will be recorded, and the audio will be available after the space ends. If you have any questions for our speakers during the discussion, please DM the Brookings account. That's Brookings INST, and we'll try to address them in the course of this conversation. So this morning, I'm joined with Célia Belin, who is a visiting fellow at the Center on the United States and Europe in the Brookings Foreign Policy Program, and also Agneska Bloch, who is a senior research assistant at the Center on the United States and Europe as well. Both these ladies have been following the French election and the French campaign in their weekly French Friday Twitter Spaces. So if you don't tune into those are really, really great discussions and a really great resource on the French elections and what you should know, who the candidates are, what the issues are, and all of that really good stuff. So follow them, tune into their French Friday conversations every Friday, especially heading into the second round of the French election. So let's get started with the meat of the conversation. I'm really, really excited to hear from you both this morning. And a special thank you to Célia, who's technically supposed to be on vacation, but is working today anyway. So thank you, Célia.
You're welcome. It's a big day.
Célia, can you please give us a rundown of the results from yesterday? And were you surprised by anything? Because I certainly was.
Yes, thank you, Raman. So probably most listeners on the call this morning will have seen the results, but I'll recall some of them anyway. What we've seen yesterday is somewhat higher mobilization that we were fearing with people coming to the polls, not in large numbers, but still mobilizing. In particular, to get Macron a bit more points that were expected. So Macron was able, the French president incumbent candidate, was able to come up on top. He ended up the first round at 27.84% of the vote, which is slightly lower than the polls predicted just 15 days ago, but much higher than was feared in the last few days. Macron is followed by Marine Le Pen. So she's the one making it to second round, the National Rally candidate, far-right candidate. She's at 23.15% this morning. And one of the surprise of this election, which really was the story of yesterday night, not only that Macron was decisively first, that Le Pen had such a high score after having quite a tough campaign, and we can come back on this. The third man, Jean-Luc Mélenchon from the left, France Insoumise, with a coalition called l'Union Populaire now, had 21.95%, and it demonstrated a mobilization of his camp in trying to get him to second round, facing Emmanuel Macron instead of Marine Le Pen. And then all other very surprising results come down to the fact that everybody else is under 10% and much lower actually than 10%. In particular, far-right Reconquête, Éric Zemmour, who was the story of 2021, the whole second half of 2021, a sort of French Donald Trump or French Tucker Carlson, who only got 7% of the vote. And I say only because he was so high in the poll at some point, even though, 7% for someone who was not a politician just a year ago is still a very high score. And three other very important scores are the one of the right, Les Républicains, Valérie Pécresse, who only reaches to have, so she ends up with less than 5%. Les Républicains is the party of Jacques Chirac, the party of Nicolas Sarkozy. So, a very mainstream established party who is used to having power, to be in power, and really is following the center left is now having a massive crisis and could risk extinction. So Pécresse really ends up with less than 5%. Same for Yannick Jadot, the Green candidate, at 4.63%. So that's a good number for the Greens, but it's a disappointing number at a moment when a large part of the electorate is very concerned with climate change and other environmental issues. And finally, I will mention the socialist candidate, again, a party that is used to be in power, party of François Mitterrand, of François Hollande. Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, finishes only with 1.75%. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Célia. That was really, really helpful. I kind of want to come back to this idea of the strength of political parties maybe later on in the conversation. Ishan Tharoor of the Washington Post wrote a really, really thought-provoking piece this morning about what Macron has done to French politics and French political parties, especially the center parties. So I'm hoping we can come back to that in a little bit. But Agneska, I want to turn to you to provide a little bit of context on how the lay of the land was going into Sunday. How were the polls looking? What were some of the major issues, if any, that voters were most concerned about? And were the candidates doing enough to address those issues in the lead up to round one? Over to you.
Thanks, Ramon, for the question. So I think I want to start with looking at the polls over the past 6 months, but really focusing on the past couple of weeks. So Macron had been fairly steady since early September, around 24-25%, until basically the war in Ukraine began in late February. And at that point, we saw something that we last, I think, witnessed during the very beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, when Macron declared war against the coronavirus and started to, present himself as the war president, the wartime president in France. And so the same effect happened. There was a rally around the flag effect, which is well documented. And he jumped from, as I said, about 25% to over 30%. About 2 weeks after the war had started on March 10th. And at that point, something interesting happened. He had been far ahead of everyone else. And the second candidate during most of this time had been the person who will advance with him to the second round, Marine Le Pen. She had also been stable. But around the time that Macron peaked, she also started to rise. And then his peak was followed by a descent. And this is why there was a lot of nervousness in France last week among commentators, analysts, and the general public. There was really, really some worry because their numbers started to tighten. And so Macron and his longtime lead ahead of the fray was really called into question. And in some ways, this isn't really surprising. After a peak, things always come down. And so, of course, Macron descended from his 30% and came back into the 20s. But it was really a pretty dramatic effect to watch Marine Le Pen rise so much. And I think one thing that explains this is that, Célia alluded to some strategic voting on the left. But I think we saw some strategic voting start to take place, or at least in intentions of votes, on the right too. And Zemmour, the other far-right candidate Célia mentioned, many of his supporters started to flock to Marine Le Pen already last week, understanding that it was going to be a question of making sure that their candidate or someone who resembled their candidate made it to the second round. So I think an important piece of context is really this huge worry in France as the numbers got much closer. But Mélenchon's rise was also something big that happened last week that we really weren't seeing ahead of that. He had been around 10, 11% for most of the fall and the winter. But around the same time that, as I was saying, Macron peaked during the war, which is ongoing, of course, but about 2 weeks into the war, Mélenchon also started to rise again because many on the left were seeing him as the most viable candidate to make sure that someone from the left got into the second round. So that's somewhat of the context on numbers. Mélenchon rising, Pécresse was decreasing, Zemmour, of course, was also decreasing, and then Jadot and Hidalgo were pretty low already last week. I think, you asked me about what the different issues were that were on people's minds. In the week before this first round of the election, purchasing power, which has been really top of mind for a lot of French, and I can give a little bit of context on this. I think people are particularly worried about the effect of the war in Ukraine on daily prices, gas prices, etc. And so about 54% of French, according to polls from last week, had as their top concern purchasing power. The second issue that rose in these polls was the war in Ukraine with 33%, and then the environment was at 26%. And other priorities that came a little bit lower were the health system, immigration, inequalities, etc. And I just want to quickly compare this to where people were before the war to give some context as to, how much precedence that took over other issues. So here's another poll from January. Purchasing power was similar. It was at 52% of French were concerned about purchasing power. But then the health systems, and of course this is January 2022, almost 2 years into the coronavirus pandemic, 30% of French were worried about health systems, 29% were worried about the environment, and 28% were worried about immigration. So I'll just finish by saying, the war in Ukraine colored for a lot of people this presidential race, and it hadn't been that way, of course, in January.
Thank you, Agneska. That was a very good explanation, and I think a lot of people
and
are
Raman,
also. Yeah, go ahead, Célia.
Can I ask? I just want to add one point, a very important point that was striking when Agneska was presenting these numbers. I am now reminded how low the polls were for Jean-Luc Mélenchon all across the winter months and including going into this election. And the mobilization that happened in 2 weeks over Jean-Luc Mélenchon out of the fear of Marine Le Pen ending up in first in the first round, or in trying to get him to face Macron instead of Marine Le Pen. This type of mobilization really happened almost overnight. 1 out of 5 people coming into the place to vote had not decided who to vote for, and they really decided at the last minute. And so what has happened is also a consequence of a lack of good polling for Jean-Luc Mélenchon right until the end. Because if the story had been that Mélenchon was this close to Le Pen, you would have seen very different behavior from a lot of Macron voters, a lot of Mélenchon, Jadot voters potentially. So really, the extreme change on this side of the electorate has had unpredictable results and is one of the big story of this first round.
As a follow-up to that, can you, Célia and Agneska too, please feel free to jump in, talk about the length of the campaign cycle heading into the first round? I know you both talked about this a little bit in your French Friday conversations on Twitter Spaces, but how much does the length of the campaign cycle heading into round one have to do with what you just said, Célia?
So you have two types of campaign. You have the pre-campaign and then you have the official campaign. The pre-campaign lasts, it's like in the US, a little bit less. The US is almost 2 years, but in France it could last for a year or at least a good 6 months where, it's top of the news, everybody talks about it. And this pre-campaign, especially in the fall, was very much colored by the rise of the far-right Éric Zemmour. And that was the story of the town. But this year in particular, the pre-campaign really got overshadowed completely in terms of news by two major events. One is, of course, COVID and the Omicron virus in particular at the end of the year with the questions of how should we behave? What is the risk? And it's not the same type of lockdowns than a year ago, but still in terms of preoccupation, it was very, very high in the media cycle. And so in spite of sort of Zemmour's rise and interest for Zemmour in the fall, over the winter months, it was really all about Omicron. And obviously, starting on February 24th, the only story still dominating to this day, maybe until, just 3 days ago, was the war in Ukraine for its barbaric and shocking nature, for the danger it represents to France and to the rest of Europe, and the profound change it brings. The war in Ukraine has overshadowed everything else. And so the official campaign, which started on March 4th, and for which Emmanuel Macron, who was, frontline on the war in Ukraine response and the shuttle diplomacy established with Russia, only announced his candidacy the day before this period official campaign started with a simple letter. And he was a bit cocky that way, that he saw that his responsibility sort of preventing him from campaigning. And so you had a very short period still, dominated by one, the war in Ukraine, and second, the idea that Macron was going to win anyway. And so there was a lack of interest on part of the French public until the last 15 days when polls went all over the place, when we've noticed the difficulties of Emmanuel Macron not even campaigning very much. And so you've had a very intense 2 weeks, but that's only 2 weeks. It was which created, I think, a lot of the unpredictability of these results compared to other years.
Thank you, Célia. That was very helpful. Let's stay on the topic of Macron and what the campaign sort of looks like for him moving forward into the second round. And Agneska, I'd like to start with you. What do you think it looks like, and what are some of the things that he should really focus on in the next few weeks?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. One big thing, I'll start with the second part of your question, which is what he should focus on. I read earlier the priorities of the French people at the moment. I think that Macron needs, if he's going to win, to prove that he will address those and cares about addressing those. He's, of course, done so with the war on Ukraine. Célia wrote a great piece a couple months ago now on his shuttle diplomacy around the war in Ukraine. So I think, of course, for the second issue that's top of mind for French people, he's done a lot. But on the question of purchasing power, which I said is top of mind for 54% of French, I think that he would need to really prove that he also is concerned about that and will really prioritize their interests on that particular front moving forward. I know that we'll talk more, I'm sure, later about Marine Le Pen, but she has done so far really a good job of addressing that particular issue. She's been very responsive to polls and to the fact that for so many, that's the absolute priority at the moment as prices are rising. So that will really be a challenge for Macron moving forward. I think in addition, Macron just has not campaigned very much so far. He's been in the role of president. And so I think over the next 2 weeks, he'll switch gears fully into Macron, the candidate, and have to sell not only, the legacy of the past 5 years, but especially the fact that he has a positive program for another 5 years as president of France. So that will be a challenge. Also, he needs, at this point, we can talk more about this, but he does not have a wealth of votes that he can really draw on moving into the second round for sure. The Green candidate, Yannick Jadot, the Socialist candidate, Anne Hidalgo, the Communist, Fabien Roussel, and Valérie Pécresse of the Republicans, all 4 of those candidates have called on their voters to give their votes to Macron. And together, that amounts to about 13%. So if he started off with 28, he has that, assuming that everyone actually follows what their candidates said that they should do and encourage
Which we
them to
should
do.
not assume, probably.
Which we should not assume, absolutely.
Mhm.
But let's be a little bit optimistic for a second for Macron. And let's think that he does get that 28 plus 13%. He then, is only at 41. And to win the second round would need over 50%. We've talked a bit already about Mélenchon and why it was that he rose to over 20%. I think Célia said 21.75. It's absolutely not a sure thing that all of those voters would go to Macron. In 2017, if I remember correctly, Mélenchon got, again, he got about 20% of the vote in the first round that year, and only, I think, 52% of those voters in the second round voted for Macron. The remaining 50%, were split between about 7% for Marine Le Pen and then 40% either abstained or voted null or blank. So it will be a
very
challenge.
Different year, correct? Like we cannot assume. So you mentioned maybe half of them could vote for Macron, but the anti-Macron front has also solidified in this camp.
Absolutely. It has solidified. And so we're now kind of faced with 2 different problems. I mean, Macron's trying to draw on this idea of a Republican front in France, and that everyone who isn't the far right would rally behind him to make sure that the far right doesn't get elected to the highest office in France. But on the other hand, there is this anti-Macron camp that you're talking about, Célia, and I think it's very, very possible that many on the left will either not show up or cast a protest vote. And so I think the big thing to watch for Macron and for us as commentators and analysts is what's going to happen with these 21.75% of French voters who elected or who chose Mélenchon yesterday. Of course, as we've said, not all of these are his core supporters. Only about 10 or 11% of the French electorate is really a core supporter of Mélenchon who would have chosen him, according to polls weeks ago. So about half of the voters that he received yesterday are people who were defecting from other left parties and choosing Mélenchon because they saw him as the best chance for the left to be elected president. So I think it's possible that we will see, though Célia, caveats very well that we have no idea what will happen, and 2022 is not 2017, but I think there's a chance that we'll see about half of those voters go to Macron, which makes it all the more tight of a race moving forward. Polls have been showing that in a second round between the 2 of them, it's very tight, and Macron receives between 51 and I think 54% of the vote compared to against Marine Le Pen. And that's just a very narrow margin for victory. So I think things are uncertain at this point.
Oof, thank you very much, Agneska. Célia, did you want to do the flip side of that? What does the campaign look like for Le Pen moving forward? And
Sure.
Yeah, what will she try to do to pull ahead of Macron in the next few weeks?
So there's a paradox for Marine Le Pen. Marine Le Pen really got a high score, more than 23% of the vote yesterday. And still, because the latest polls at the end of the campaign put her even higher, or at least put her on par with Emmanuel Macron, there is a small feeling that she had underperformed. It's more of a perception than a reality. And that the risk of Le Pen and the momentum that she was gathering might not have been as strong as we can expect it, and potentially Macron is actually stronger. So this will mean that she needs to prove that the momentum continues. So for her, second round polls showing her neck to neck with Macron is a good thing, and she will try to build up on this. She has the support of the Éric Zemmour candidate, 7% that go directly to her, and potentially the other sort of far-right candidate, Nicolas Dupont-Aignan, will also give her 2%. Again, some of these people will not go to vote for Marine Le Pen, but let's assume she gets 9%. So it brings her already to above 30%. But it's a long way to 50%. In particular, when the coverage, for example, in the mainstream media will be largely negative. We know that Marine Le Pen has made enormous progress for her camp since 2017, but she's not quite there in terms of acceptability. What she's done in the past 5 years is normalize herself, normalize her persona. She tries to appear more gentle. She's put forward this idea that she's a single mom. She breeds cats and is very she's an everyday person, and she understands people's everyday problems. She's going to continue to focus on that. But at this point, she has a question that remains unanswered, is how to get to above 50%. First, she needs to gather her camp, but her camp was split with the extreme far right that is now too toxic. So she doesn't want to go that way anymore, even though some elements of their interest, anti-immigration interest, is in her program still very much, national preference, anti-immigration, etc. But she just publicly doesn't want to try and attract them. So she will try to widen her stance. And there's a risk there that she loses her brand or loses her voice in the meantime. So today she came out and already go and meet voters and talked about inflation. So she will continue to focus on the socioeconomic problems. And I would put that in the context of the war in Ukraine because, and we can come back on this, Marine Le Pen was largely pro-Russia, pro-Putin, anti-American candidate. But since the beginning of the war, she's tamed it down largely, and she has focused on purchasing power, socioeconomic issues, and she has been served by the war in that regard because of sanctions that were being voted that put pressure on oil prices, including gas prices that skyrocketed. And gas prices is an everyday problem. So Marine Le Pen, by focusing squarely on these issues, in particular gas prices, was able to have people forgot her sort of pro-Putin view and really, care and demonstrate that she cared about issues that are relevant to people today.
Let's stay on that topic for just a moment, because I think it could be relevant also to the American election cycle coming up, the midterm elections this year. A lot of people across the world are feeling the effects of the Ukraine war in their pockets. And as you said, Célia, that Le Pen is sort of drawing on this in the election cycle, in the campaign, to sort of, show people that she understands this. On the flip side, how does Macron, who, has really made, as you write very well, Célia, and you've studied over the years, has really made, an attempt to make France an important player in Europe and have an important voice in world affairs. How does he sort of respond to that sort of situation where he's tried so hard to put France on the world stage and to show his own personal leadership in issues across the world, but at home people are really being hit in their wallets and in their household finances.
Do you want me to take that up? I think Agnieszka also should come in on this, but yes, for the nature of the crisis that unfolded, which were first COVID, but now obviously the war in Ukraine, and for Macron's own persona, you've seen really a leader that has exercised leadership at the highest level. So he's a very pro-European president. He has taken upon him to sort of represent a European voice in the relationship with Putin. It was very bilateral when he started, but now he has established this communication line and tries to push the voice of Europe. In the meantime, this sort of high politics engagement has prevented him from really appearing as a national leader, caring about again the French and their issues. And at some point, he has started to create resentment. Even the way that Macron campaigned for his own re-election, which was very short in time. He has done only one major political rally with 30,000 people, but just the one rally. He has refused to engage in any debate before in the first round. So he has not debated any of his opponents and will have to debate Marine Le Pen only for the second round. And he has only met, a bunch of voters during a few strolls at the end of the sort of 2 weeks campaign at this point that he performed. All of this gives the feeling that Macron doesn't care or believes that this is just paperwork basically to get reelected, and so it creates enormous resentment. And there's that has been, I think, completely overlooked by his camp. This idea that potentially for everyday people that Macron despises them. And for this, I want to remind a few people, because it has already come up today when Macron went and now is seriously campaigning and went to meet a voter who told him she was personally offended when back in January, Macron said that he wanted to piss off the unvaccinated. Because it was a moment when he was putting in place his vaccine pass, and so he wanted to piss off the unvaccinated. And she said that the way that Macron talks about regular people and in this way that appears to be despising of them, unrespectful of them, was really hurtful. He needs to work on this image of the international leader who does all kinds of grand politics things, but that is unable to relate to regular voters. I think that it was one of its strengths in 2017. Agnieszka, do you have a view?
Yeah, I just want to give a little bit more context on the domestic side and say, I think this is a problem that he's struggled with from day one. And the fact that the Gilets jaunes crisis persisted for so long and the response by the government was seen as so inadequate shows that people already are just predisposed to not buy any kind of response that he makes today to rising prices and any empathy that he might try to express in the face of this new crisis. So I just think the decks are stacked against him on this particular question. And I think time is running out to prove that he's sincere when he tries to show that he cares.
You're right. Agnieszka is very right to point out the Gilets jaunes, which is one of these crystallizing moments for the image of Macron. And people sort of often overlook the fact that this was very much a populist protest, and the way the way that the government dealt with it was again a sensation from people supporting the Gilets jaunes, that the government didn't pay attention at all to what they were saying, and there's a form of social violence that has been described on the part of opponents of Macron, that they perceive the president is not trying to listen to them or really care about their issues.
I want to stay on this topic because we've gotten a few audience questions about it. Can we talk a little bit about, and Agneska, I'll go to you first on this, about the youth vote in France? It looks like the youth vote almost propelled Mélenchon into round two. He took about 15% of the youth vote. How do you think these voters will act for round two? Will they go to Macron? What does he have to do to sort of try to pull these voters into his camp? And will Marine Le Pen do a better job of doing so? So your thoughts on this, Agneska?
I'm afraid I'm not very optimistic about being able to pull in youth voters, which of course I'm a part. So I'd like to. It's true that they absolutely supported Mélenchon overwhelmingly in this first round. We had 34% of people aged 18 to 24 voting for Mélenchon, and then 31% of those aged 25 to 34, if you still allow those to count as the younger vote at least, voting for Mélenchon. But I think the most important number that we need to point out is the abstention among younger people. It reached 42% for the group aged 18 to 24 and 46 among the 25 to 34 age range. And I think the biggest concern moving into the second round is that once again, all of those voters will abstain, and perhaps even more of them, given that their candidate, overwhelmingly, Mélenchon, won't be advancing, and that there isn't a plausible left alternative in this second round. I think in 2017, Macron had more convincingly appealed to voters on the left who care about social inequalities, climate, racial injustice, social issues in France, etc. And it was a little bit more believable to those voters that he would really prioritize those issues during his 5-year mandate. I think today, really, the left, and especially these younger voters, are disappointed and disillusioned with the progress that he's made on those fronts. And so I really think that we're likely to see a very high abstention among those age groups.
Thank you, Agneska. And Célia, I wonder if you wanted to comment on, and I know you sort of touched on this earlier too, on voter turnout and how it was somewhat lower in this round one than previous presidential election. And what does this bode for round two? And should Macron or Le Pen be worried about lower voter turnout, or do you really think it's going to affect them at all?
Well, first, it's a new election starting today. Really, first round, second rounds, these are entirely different dynamics. And so it's, of course, participation often goes together. But in terms of the types of calculation that voters make, because voters are always strategic as much as politicians, and they want to push their ideas, but they also want to support the person that is either the least offensive to them or someone who will, make their voice heard. So for the second round, the choices are much more reduced. You only have 2 people. So this is very much, in particular this year, a vote that will concentrate into either from a Le Pen perspective, she will try to make this an anti-Macron referendum. Do you really want this guy to stay 5 more years in power? And obviously, Emmanuel Macron will try to make this an anti-Le Pen referendum. Do you really want this woman with this type of platform to become president of France? And so, and that's sort of the subtext. So even if both candidates will make promises and talk about the future, really the underlying perspective is highly negative. It's a vote against the candidate. So the participation rate this time around was about 73.5% of the electorate went to vote, which is very low. It's the second lowest since the beginning of the Fifth Republic. The first lowest was 2002, which was the first time that a far-right leader, which is Jean-Marie Le Pen, the father of Marine Le Pen, made it to second round. And so we know potentially that the lack of mobilization, the high abstention rate, the lack of interest for the race really helps extremes to have higher scores. So potentially Marine Le Pen would benefit from a low participation. But at the same time, her voters have changed over time. Her voters are also, because she has tried to widen her stance, she has looked for working class French people. She has looked for lower middle class, for less educated, for and trying to rally these people. And these people, when there's less mobilization, tend to vote less. So abstention can cut both ways. In any case, they both have an interest in having mobilization and excitement around this election for whoever to win, to have momentum and be able to, to govern. At this point, Emmanuel Macron is still very much the favorite candidate. He has a higher chance to win. But if he's re-elected, it would be better for him to have really squarely defeated Marine Le Pen with a strong mobilization, and hopefully to have more than, just 51% of the vote, but like a stronger mandate. So when he gets back to governing, he has a stronger mandate for the reforms he might want to do, or at least, some form of popular reconciliation around his own election.
Thank you, Célia. Agneska, did you have any further thoughts on this?
I think I would just add that I'll be closely watching the debate on April 20th, which is when Macron will have, a very public chance to defend his positive proposals against Marine Le Pen. And I think it'll be really interesting to see who he's trying to appeal to, both in the content of those proposals and over the course of the debate. So please watch that space. And I'm sure Célia and I will talk about it on our French Friday the following day.
Thank you, Agneska. And folks, please do follow Célia and Agneska to keep track of their Twitter Spaces conversations. Like I said, they're super helpful. Even if you're sort of a novice in the French political game, or you've been watching French politics for a long time, I think they're really, really helpful conversations.
And they are excellent replays that I try to tweet out because we can listen to recorded Twitter Space for 30 days. And so we already have a bunch of replays from previous Twitter Space that I tweeted out on Saturday.
Yes, please follow them so you can keep track of all of those really excellent conversations. So we're coming up on time, ladies. We agreed to go for about 45 minutes or so. But I want to end on looking at the broader ramifications of this election for the rest of the world. Célia, let's start with you. Can you please walk us through sort of what's at stake for Europe broadly, but also for the West if Macron wins or if he loses, and what that really means, especially if you can touch on the war in Ukraine as well.
Sure, but that does
small question
to
small question.
2 hours and much more coffee. So I'll try to make it quick. No, there's a lot at stake for France but also potentially for Europe and somewhat for the world, in the fact that these two candidates have very different approaches to international relations. In particular, Macron is the pro-European candidate, and that was already his political identity in 2017. And since he's been in power, he really has, one of the few compasses of Macron's politics, because Macron is a pragmatist. He can go left, he can go right, he can go here and there. One of the few guiding lights is European sovereignty, this idea of a strong, independent, powerful Europe that he has pushed at the European level time and time again. If Marine Le Pen was to make it as I must say, first female president, which will be one of her campaign arguments, if she makes it to the presidency, she has long been an anti-European candidate. She's not anymore pushing for Frexit, the French exit of the EU. She's not anymore pushing for an exit of the euro, but she has these views of a Europe of nations, which is complementary to other, far right or nationalist leaders in Europe. She's close to Viktor Orban, the Hungarian president, or to the Polish prime minister. She believes she has support across Europe in nationalistic parties who don't want any more integration, who want to cooperate as Europeans, but don't want to relinquish any sovereignty at the Brussels level. So if she was to get into power, she would still be constrained by everything that happened in the past. So one of the idea that has been, pushed by one of our guests on the last French Friday, Shaheen Vallée, is that probably she'd be like the European Trump, where people around her, other European leaders, try to mitigate her impact and will probably try not to push any strong ideas to which she can veto, but really try to circumscribe her effort. She will have to have a few wins, but basically just pause on European integration. So that would be probably the main effect, the pause on European integration. And last point is on Russia. She's a clear, Putinophile. In the past, she was very much pro-Russian. She has always been highly critical of the US and of NATO. However, again, she needed to recenter. So what would happen concretely is that you would expect her to support no more sanctions against Russia. She has criticized sanctions on fossil fuels. And so, again, more than a reverse of either European integration or sanctions on Russia, it would be just a pause and just a very unwilling France, and so a completely shift of behavior for a country that in the past 5 years under Macron's leadership has been very forceful and very dynamic in its European policies. You would see kind of the exact opposite. Agneska, do you have any other take on this?
I agree with everything that you said. I think I would just underscore that should Macron lose to Marine Le Pen in the second round, we would lose a huge motor for Europe, and especially at a time when the German government, which recently, of course, came in last fall, is very keen, I think, to continue to be a driving force on Europe in tandem with a French government that's friendly to that. And I think a lot could be done between the two for Europe in collaboration, of course, with other member states, if they were to both have governments that were so pro-European sovereignty and integration and independence, which are, of course, things that Macron continued to push again and again over the course of his diplomacy in recent weeks and months at this point. So I think it would be a blow to Europe for Marine Le Pen to be elected. Of course, that almost goes without saying. And then I just want to say one last thing, which is we can't forget that, underneath the veil of Marine Le Pen's normalization recently, which, as Célia mentioned, was kind of an effect of being compared to Zemmour, who was even more extreme, but also just a tactic on her part, a strategy since 2017. I think under the face of that, there's still a very, very similar program to what it was in 2017. And so we can't forget that domestically and, on the European level and the international level, it would be a far-right government. So I just want to end by underscoring that.
Well, ladies, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, for all those explanations, and for great context heading into round 2 of the French elections. I'm sure you'll be doing more analysis in your French Friday Twitter spaces on your accounts. You can also look out for a wonderful video explainer that Célia put together for us on Macron's foreign policy doctrine, which should be out very, very soon. Be sure to follow Célia and Agneska to stay on top of their analysis in what will be a very, very consequential French election coming up. Thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in. If you have any questions about the French elections that you'd like to DM us, please do so, and I will follow up with those by passing them along to Célia and Agneska to have them address in their future Twitter Spaces conversations. So thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day, everyone.